So I bring my greetings from New York and from the Lucis Trust and from all coworkers in the United States who are also working to do what we can to help bring forward the soul of our nation, just as all of you who have already presented and those that have yet to present on this conference are working to do the same in regards to your nation, because as we know from our teachings that one of the key responsibilities of disciples in any country is to do what we can to bring forward the soul of the nation. And as I believe it was Sasha Alexander pointed out, we all have lived many lives in many different countries. And so we're just passing through this particular incarnation and for a reason. And so we're here to do what we can to support it. As Philip said, my task today is to touch upon a brief history of the United States, very brief. I'm not a historian, neither am I a geopolitical person. I'm basically a student of life, a student of the ageless wisdom. So I hope you will forgive me for my brevity in those regards. It's great to be working as we prepare for this important first of the three spiritual festivals, the Aries festival, which will occur the exact time on Thursday. So we're in the full tide of that preparatory period. And just to say that I was reading about some of the energies related to Aries and the Tibetans' words, how at least in the preparatory years towards the close of the World War, towards the close of that turning point in planetary history, a great being became available if the disciples of the world used the power of their invocative appeal to draw forth this spirit of resurrection. And the Tibetans said that this entity, this extraplanetary entity, is available during the Aries full moon. And it's a counterforce, he said, to the spirit of death, which during the war was plaguing and overshadowing the world. And I couldn't help but see the parallels between that time and this time, having passed through these challenging period in our planetary history, wherein the spirit of death has hovered over humanity. So I thought it appropriate to ask that our group during this Aries full moon work to do what we can to invoke this spirit of resurrection life that brings new life and new livingness into the body politic of humanity, into our minds, because as we know, Aries is primarily a mental sign. I come forth, and from the plane of mind, I rule. So it's just to add it to our group field, this opportunity that we have. Although it's an extra planetary entity, we're also told that this spirit of resurrection stands within the center of Shambhala as one of the Kumaras, I would assume along the first ray line. And since our focus is very much on the first ray in this conference, on the gifts and challenges which each nation has, it would seem that this is an appropriate request, an invocative appeal, which perhaps we can add to our meditative life. And so as all of us have been highlighting, each nation has its strengths, and these are its soul qualities. But so too does each nation have its hindrances, its weaknesses, and we all know them for what they are. But we try and focus here on the strengths, but no presentation can be complete without also touching upon some of the weaknesses, because we're at a point, it seems, at least in planetary history, wherein the weaknesses are there for all to see on the world stage. And so we can't ignore them nor deny them. But the strengths of each nation are embodied in perhaps its soul qualities, which are emblazoned in its symbols, its flag, its songs, poetry, its people, but also its leaders. And I think when we look at each nation, today we tend to focus on the leaders, but I would ask us to keep in mind all of these other qualities of each nation, which are so much perhaps more important than the passing leadership. And when we look at the nations and our nation, we have to try and do so stepping out of the present day challenges so conditioned by our approach to the 2025 conclave, by the approach to the spiritual hierarchies externalization and the subsequent reappearance of the Christ. We have to look with a long-range vision. We have to understand what the Tibetan said in relationship to that long-range vision. He's not speaking in terms of our temporal understanding. He's speaking from a much wider, broader, and deeper historical perspective. And so when we look at this triangle, which Philip has been explicating so wonderfully, and that we've been exploring in our meditations between the United States, the UK, and Russia, we do have to step outside the boundaries of the present divisions, which are sadly conditioning that triangle from the exoteric perspective, but surely from the soul of those three nations. The triangle is working. The triangle is there, supporting the United States, supporting the UK, and supporting Russia. And as Philip has been highlighting, that certainly the Center Geneva is coming into play deeply in regards to that triangle. So when we look to the United States, as has been highlighted here in the many talks that have been given, we know that the United States is very much conditioned by the fact that it is, as has been said, a child of Europe. And the Tibetan, in a quote that was highlighted by Christina, the American continent therefore takes on all of the history, all of the strengths, all of the culture, and all of the challenges that Europe has been struggling with and blessed with. The United States takes part in that. And that's an important point to remember. So while we are the child has the genetic makeup of its parents. And the United States is somewhat of a strange hybrid, for although the European nations each have their own long history, their long culture. But in terms of the United States, as we know, this culture and this people is an admixture of all of the many different strains, the rays and the astrological indicators that come from all of the different European countries, as well as overriding those things, its own race structure, its own astrological makeup. So we are a mutt, we are a hybrid nation, But we do have the genetic makeup, as I said, of our founders, our history, our European ancestry. But the United States kind of imported all of that as if we downloaded an app into a nation that had its own history, its own conditioning influences for many, many hundreds of years by the native peoples, the Native Americans, who lived here rather peacefully, by and large, for centuries, with their own culture, and who were probably very resonant with the fact, as has also been highlighted in this conference, that the landmass of the United States is that of ancient Atlantis, with its strong psychism, its strong conditioning influences, and its strong challenges, its overly developed psychic tendencies. All of these were very much a part of the resonant life of the native peoples. And then suddenly imported into that, we downloaded all of this Western culture with its brutality, and this has created a stain on the national life of this country, one which we are seeking to rectify. And with time, we certainly will rectify and bring about a greater harmony between the native peoples and these imported European implants. And then the United States has another stain, which is the slave trade, which flourished for some time, creating much division, which is still part of our national life to this day, which is again trying to be rectified by coming to our attention, by being brought to our attention, and doing what we can as individuals and as a nation to heal the wounds of these stains on our national life. And so just to turn briefly, because it's been dealt with a number of times, on the astrology and the rayology of the United States. We are blessed in many ways with our rising sign and our soul, which align us with the incoming age. As has been mentioned many times, the soul of this nation is second ray, the ray of love, wisdom, the ray that qualifies the spiritual hierarchy of the planet, the ray of the Christ and the Buddha. And we're told in the teachings that this second ray influence 2,500 years ago was pouring into northern India and was largely responsible for the influx of the energy of the Buddha and the many arhats that came in at his time. The second ray made that dispensation of Buddhism possible. But in the 2,500 years since that great inpouring of second ray energy in India, the light, we're told, has moved steadily westward. And now this second ray energy is hovering over the Western Hemisphere, over the United States. But we must include Canada in that dispensation and South America, where there is and has been a great spiritual awakening. This Western Hemisphere is very aligned with, perhaps because of that ancient Atlantean dispensation, there's a great openness to spirituality and to psychism. And so this second ray soul of the United States aligns deeply with this inpouring of second ray energy, which will make and contribute, allow the United States to contribute towards the externalization and the influence of the spiritual hierarchy. The States is related to the second aspect of this second ray, the love aspect. And we're qualified by the intuitive mind, whereas the UK is more related to the concrete mind. The US is more related to the soul mind, the mind that links to the higher realms of the intuition. Whereas in another planetary triangle with Brazil, we're told that in the future, Brazil will relate to the higher or abstract mind. And so the United States is also governed at the soul level by the sign of Aquarius, the sign which is incoming, the sign which is conditioning life increasingly with each passing decade. And so the States is fully prepared through its rising sign and its soul ray to become one of the most instrumental countries in terms of the reappearance and the externalization. And some say because of this great potential, that's why it's hypothesized that the planetary angel is now focused through the United States, and likewise the planetary dweller. So the battle for the soul of the nation, but also in terms of the externalization, we might conjecture, is being fought out in the United States. Hence the tremendous attacks being leveled at the soul of this struggling nation. So when we look to the personality and the sun sign of the United States, as with all countries, this is where we can see more of the weaknesses and the challenges, but also the strengths, because we want to rise to make our sun sign and our personality rays vehicles for the soul to express itself. And so we can't look at the personality and the personality ray as simply obstacles. We have to try and learn to work to, as disciples, to bring forward the strengths, likewise, of those conditioning energies. And so, as we know, for the United States, we have another air sign, the sign of Gemini, the sign of the warring brothers, the soul and the personality. We have them both here in full form, strengthened by our sixth ray personality. And so we see this as one of the weaknesses, but perhaps because of the bridging function of Gemini, when we become more under the influence of our soul, we see the potential to bring about a harmony, perhaps with the influx of the fourth ray coming to our aid, the overriding influence of the sign of Libra, which we're told conditions the planet as a whole when we're moving from one age to the next. We always have and can draw upon the energy of Libra. So we have hopes that the warring brothers of the United States on the world stage, with its brother, Russia, the other sixth ray personality, Aquarian soul, these warring brothers, we have the hope that they can strive towards their higher spiritual possibilities and bring about a resolution to this Cold War mentality, which has done such harm for these brothers, who are essentially at the soul level, great brothers. And so let's hope that our work over these few days is strengthening that soul relationship, which could be one of the most important outcomes of this conference, a resolution to this warring, at least a contribution towards a resolution, towards communication instead of the stalemate of non-dialogue. We need to have dialogue. The air signs need to speak. And so this warring brotherhood is also conditioning extremely powerfully the country as in itself, the war between the Democrats and the Republicans. This war is being fomented by those forces that substand these outer forces, because we're all being played, as you might understand, we're being played by forces that underlie the outer forms, just as there is a hierarchy of light, a hierarchy which seems to support the soul of any nation. So too, we have to realize, are there forces that are aligned with materialism? And these forces are strongly conditioning the United States, causing division between what should be brothers, which should be groups of people who have differences of opinion, but nonetheless who can come forward to work to resolve their differences through dialogue. Again, we're a double air sign nation. We should work with dialogue in resolving our considerable challenges with compromise. We have to work with compromise. And so the United States is a battleground, but it has a history of freedom, which is emblazoned in its symbol of the Statue of Liberty, shown here, a great symbol of the promise of our nation, a promise which, as I said earlier, has not been abrogated by the present challenges, but instead must be fomented by the souls of all of the disciples in our land to bring forth that second ray beauty of our national life. Interestingly enough, as many of you know, the Statue of Liberty was given to us by France as a great symbol for the promise. France, which was also going through its revolutionary struggles shortly after those of the United States, shortly inspired by the United States, but inspired as well by the discovery of the planet Uranus, which rules the Aquarian age, which rules the United States soul. And there is a poem which was given to this statue. It is carved in the statue. And I just wanted to read the last line, the last stanza of the poem, which gives you a synopsis of the soul of our nation. It says, "Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." It's hard to read that. It speaks of the great compassion. And again, I said the great promise of the nation, because it is true that many of those that came to this land were the downtrodden, were the poor, were the Irish, for example, whose heritage was being compromised by the famine. They had to leave, there was no food. And later, by many from Germany, who are likewise struggling. And later from Italy, many of those who couldn't really make it, who weren't really established in their home countries, took the risk, as did my grandparents, to take a rather treacherous journey across the sea. Young women by themselves, it was very treacherous. So those who came came because they felt they had no option. And so this land of immigrants is largely, and still is largely, a land of immigrants who were downtrodden and poor. And so we are, I think, very much an earth chain country. A lot of earth chainers came here. And so there was a deep sense of building oneself up from one's bootstraps, holding one, that anybody could make it. Very different than my understanding, at least, might be flawed, of the European nations, which by and large were governed by, at that time, by monarchies, by invested wealth and power, which lie in the hands of generations passed on to generations. Whereas in the United States, there was always held out the opportunity that could come from making it. And this is embodied in our founding fathers, who, while primarily from the wealthier class at the time, were nonetheless hardworking people, farmers in many cases, landowners, but very brilliant people who took all of the good that they could find from the governments of Europe and embodied them in our Constitution. And so it's a very inspired piece of writing, which is under threat at this time, but nonetheless still is supposedly the rule of the land. But the one figure that I just wanted to briefly highlight is Abraham Lincoln, who is an example, we're told by the Tibetan, of our country's racial avatar. It's said that the racial avatar comes forth near the founding of a nation. So he came forth somewhat after the founding. He came forth at a time when he was said to be from one of the poorest families. He grew up in dire poverty and was an example. A racial avatar is an example of the highest qualities of the people of a nation. And if you study the life of Lincoln, he came from nothing. He had a tremendously challenging childhood. His mother died. His father was cruel and not on his side at all. He was fortunate to have later a stepmother who did believe in him and started to try and educate him. They had no money. He went to a one-room schoolhouse where he walked to get there every day, was literally starving most of his childhood. And through sheer force of will and character, he became the racial avatar of our nation. A brilliant man, a lawyer, a brilliant speaker, a strong, shrewd politician, but yet someone who struggled throughout his entire life with mental illness, basically. And so that's another quality that's quite apparent. I live in New York City. It's quite apparent with the strong influence here of mental illness. It's a Gemini challenge. Lincoln was not a Gemini, but he struggled throughout his life and took all kinds of substances, which led to poisoning, in fact, because mental illness was never treated properly in those days nor in this day. And so the United States, in a sense, holds forth to the world a cry to deal with mental challenges. And as Catherine Austin Fitts says in relationship to the United States, one of its challenges, one of the attacks on the United States at this time is a poisoning, which is not solely going on in the United States, of course. There's poisoning of the American people through toxic chemical, through a very misguided pharmaceutical industry, through agriculture, through many, many different challenges. The people of the United States are under attack. And so part of what's happening now, part of what's being brought forward now, and which is something that I hold greatly a lot of pride in, is an alternative media. Because the Tibetans said that the United States, one of the challenges of the United States was a very compromised media. And he said that at a time when there was much more truth coming out in the media than is the mainstream media than is the fact today. And the Tibetan also warned, as I spoke earlier, of the materialistic forces. He warned of the materialistic forces that were governing the land. And he said this in the 40s. And he warned that if the United States did not come to a place where it could get control of these materialistic forces, that the US, being an Aquarian soul, would in fact be left out of the gifts of the gods of the coming Aquarian dispensation. Those are sobering words, that we could be left out of the gifts of the gods if we did not get control of the materialistic forces that were governing the land at that time. And it does not seem to need to be said that we have not gotten control of these materialistic forces. This was highlighted by the well-known statements of President Eisenhower in his farewell address to the nation, who warned of the dangers of the state of the country in relationship to these materialistic forces. Likewise, President Kennedy became very aware of what was happening and spoke of them in one of his final speeches before his assassination. He spoke of these materialistic forces, which he understood. And he said, no official of my administration should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press or the public the facts they deserve to know. But as my youth was colored by his assassination and the subsequent assassinations of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy, these dark overshadowing cloud that hovered over my nation dealt a severe blow to my ability to cultivate as a young person a love for my country. And this was a fault and a shortcoming of my own, for I grew up not believing in my country's leaders and not trusting their actions. And so I had to work through my life to rebuild my own faith in my nation. And I have only done so by recognizing my role as a disciple to work with my group brothers to support the soul and to try and look more compassionately at the personality, recognizing that it's been under this attack for so many decades. This attack has led the United States under a misguided control of its sixth ray personality to be involved in endless wars or from behind the scenes, supporting endless wars, including Korea, Vietnam, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, Ukraine, and setting our sights on Russia and perhaps China. We have to ask, when will we, as a group, be able to do more to support the overshadowing angel, which is seeking recognition, seeking evocation by the group? Can we turn away from attacking our nation and do what we can to support this angel? And so recently, I just like to close with these words, which were shared by not an American broadcaster, but actually a Scottish one, someone who I admire. He was speaking of his nation, which a friend shared with him a quote from 2,500 years ago, which he thought spoke very much to the situation controlling many of the Western countries of the world at this time. He was quoting Lao Tzu. And he said that Lao Tzu was warning about a situation that was brewing in his day. He said, when rich speculators prosper, while farmers lose their land, when government officials spend money on weapons instead of cures, when the upper class are extravagant and irresponsible, and the poor have nowhere to turn, he said, all this is robbery and chaos. And he went on to say that those who try to control and use force to protect their power, they take from those who don't have enough, and they give to those who have far too much. So that's the sad state of affairs, it seems, the leaders of our time. And I just wanted to end with some hope. As I said earlier, the Tibetan sees our nation and all of our nations from a much broader perspective. And so there's much hope in the fact that this country and New York in particular are governed by the motto, I light the way. Perhaps to me, that means that outside New York, as the Tibetan said, outside all of the 5 planetary centers, there is an etheric center formulating, which is preparing the people within the planetary center and within the nation for the externalization. And so it would seem that outside New York, we might have a etheric center fomenting, building, drawing upon the second ray Aquarian soul of the nation and preparing the way, lighting the way. DK did call New York, the New York headquarters, in fact, his ashram, the outpost of his ashram. And so perhaps the Tibetan who will be one of the masters externalizing, perhaps it's his ashram formulating outside of New York. And we can draw on that strength. And we also know that the teaching, as Philip has highlighted, the teaching goes out from New York. Madame Blavatsky did much of her writing, The Secret Doctrine, in the New York Center, as did Alice Bailey in the second dispensation of that teaching. And now we're moving, and perhaps we could say we might already be within the time for the third dispensation to come out. And so who knows, maybe there is some amanuensis in our neighborhood beginning that work. And so those are the thoughts that I wanted to end with, a note of hope and of the beauty of this great nation's national life. Thank you.